And that's what Marx was talking about, by the way, and his remarks are therefore quite interesting. He has a perspective on the British, which is his own. It's a bit Marxist, if I can put it that way. Okay, yeah.
So Tim,
yes,
it's great to see you again.
Thank you.
I'm glad we have this opportunity to add to your previous interview and also maybe to correct some of the things.
Thank you. Yes, I do appreciate the chance to correct some mistakes. I mean, they range from the reasonably trivial. I mean, I did check on what Marx said about Chinese, and he did say hereditary stupidity. So I actually read through everything he wrote about China. It's a fairly slim book, but very interesting. And he uses the word hereditary to mean customary.
Okay.
So he's not talking about biological inferiority. He's talking about culture. As to stupidity, I'm not sure what he meant. He wasn't a native speaker of English anyhow. So
he was speaking in English.
He was writing in English in America. And he didn't know much about China, but, you know, it's interesting to see what he did say. I decided I needed to check as soon as I went home whether there really was translation from Chinese into Madurese, and not really, because there is a story in Madurese which is of Chinese origin, but it probably arrived in Madurese through Javanese. So I apologise to the world for that misleading statement. But the thing that I think the area where I really didn't know what I should have known was when we got on to talking about Manchu. I'm pretty sure Manchu's never been taught here, apart from when Peter Kornitsky, as you told me, did a bit of it. But Cambridge is actually quite well set up. And that's because the Wade collection has got quite a few Manchu and bilingual Manchu and Chinese books in it. I'm not sure to what extent Wade used Manchu himself. I contacted a young scholar in Hong Kong to see if he had who's working on Wade at the moment. He didn't seem to have any evidence that Wade was teaching Manchu when he was in government service, and when he was in Cambridge he didn't teach anybody anything. He just said, if you really want to learn any of this stuff, go to China. It's much easier than in Cambridge, as you probably found out. So there's quite a lot of material you could use to teach Manchu in Cambridge if anybody ever wanted to. I didn't know about that because I was only, what shall we say, I was only aware of parts of the Wade collection because it used to be on the far side of the librarian's office before they moved into the Ahoy Pavilion. And one could see it, but I never really wanted to deal with 19th century stuff anyhow. I mean, people would show up and want to use the collection. I remember Jim Polacek, who wrote on the Inner Opium War, wanted to look at some manuscript memorials that are in the Wade collection, but I didn't want to do anything like that. I was interested that he had quite a few language learning books which are ultimately of Jesuit origin and things like that. But further than that, I did not go, and the Manchu stuff is right at the back. So I never knew. I knew that some of Wiley's Manchu stuff was on the open shelves, because there was a lot on the open shelves in the old days. Because, I mean, I remember, for example, there was a Korean printing of a Tang text, which dated to, I think, to the 1470s, and it was just there on the open shelves. So you could, in theory, you could have taken it home with you. In fact, because there were very few people around who had the faintest idea whether the stuff was valuable or not, it was perfectly safe. It's now off the open shelves. Whereas SOAS did actually lose quite a lot of stuff because there were more people passing through London who knew what was what and were able to avail themselves of the opportunity.
So were they smarter, or?
Well, security was never very good in SOAS for a long time. For example, at some point, I can't remember, would have been the 70s or 80s even, there was a Rastafarian who took against the fact that there were Ethiopian books in the library, which he thought were in bondage to Babylon, as it were. So he decided he'd liberate them. So he simply opened a window and passed them out to a friend. I mean, eventually they were retrieved from his place. I mean, he didn't damage them or anything, but it was embarrassing for SOAS. And I have been told that originally SOAS had a lot of signed copies by eminent scholars passing through Husserl and Sujimor and people like that. And those are all gone because, unfortunately. Never mind.
That's a huge loss, actually.
If SOAS had wanted to make anything of it, yes. But there we are. I've never trusted the SOAS library as a custodian. That's why, as I explained earlier, I've been happy to, keep in touch with Cambridge. But beyond the Manchu stuff, the other thing I ought to have mentioned is that originally, of course, in the pre-war expansion, Mongol was taught here as well by your compatriot, whom we call Dennis Senor. Don't know what his real name is, but that's what we called him.
I guess his real name would be Shinor Danish.
Yes, yeah, because you do things the Chinese way, right? Anyhow, this guy was teaching here from the late 1940s to the start of the 1960s. He taught the Charles Borden, who became the professor of Mongol in SOAS. He also had a class he gave to Herbert Franke, who became quite prominent using Mongol and Chinese, and Dennis Twitchett, who didn't use Mongol but had some knowledge of it as a result and sat through the entire course. So at the end of the course, and this must have been in the late 1940s, possibly early 50s, Senor says to them, "You've been good lads, you've sat through my entire course. Well done, never missed a class. I appreciate that. Not many people are interested in Mongol, so I'm going to teach you something useful." When I was a young man, my brother was involved in the Eurasian fur trade. So I learned some stuff through him, and I'll tell you this. If you are buying a fur coat for your wife or your mistress or a girlfriend or whoever, look in the armpits, because that's where the bad farriers put the inferior fur. So I would like you at least to know how to buy a fur coat as a result of my experiences. So, some useful knowledge was passed on, even if Mongol studies didn't persist and had to be revivified by Caroline Humphreys through anthropology rather than in this faculty. But the whole thing about good advice, I did pick up one or two bits of good advice which I ought to pass on.
Okay.
One was from Van der Loon, and it's methodology, but it's perfectly sensible and obvious. But it was worth mentioning. And he never build a hypothesis on a hypothesis.
Okay.
Okay, because it's what amateurs do, and they end up with building castles in the air. They just go astray that way. You can just follow your own interests and end up miles off track. So that was worth remembering as a sort of methodological principle. And the other one was an old guy called John Bruff, who was professor of Sanskrit. But he also taught himself Chinese, so he could use Chinese Buddhist translations. Wasn't interested in Buddhism as such, but in the linguistic, background to some early translations, which was not Sanskrit. It was Gandhari, which was little known at that time. But if you see a mistranslation, you can often figure out what the scribe misread or had miswritten in front of him. So he knew quite a bit of Chinese, and so I got to know him slightly. And he passed on all kinds of wisdom. And the one sort of it's not really methodology, it's just a tip, and it's one you can discuss. But he said, when I was a young man, Minorski said to me, Now, Minovsky was actually a Russian Tsarist diplomat who, after 1917, was obliged to become a professor of Persian in SOAS, you know. But he said, Minovsky said to me when I was young, and I'm telling you now, never write an article unless there is a problem.
Okay.
You know, obviously, you know, you can focus an article. If you may know a lot of stuff, but if you're just saying, I know this stuff, I mean, it doesn't cohere. But if you've got a problem that gives focus to the article, it's much more cogent, obviously.
Yeah.
These are both useful tips. So, also, I was thinking I ought to at least give a brief, less than 30 minutes perhaps, expose of how I got into this stuff. Because I know some of my friends, especially in Buddhist studies, are baffled by what I do, and have said to me, you know, what's it all about? And partly because I do a range of stuff, and I explained when I was questioned about this, well, I got a range of students, you know, and you do whatever the students are interested in. Make sure you can, you know, advise people, for example, in modern Chinese history up to a point, you know. But thinking back, as I explained at the start, yes, I was in an environment where I was aware of the wider world, but I wasn't in it. In fact, I was immured in a boarding school with the Sons of Missionaries. But then on my 16th birthday, something happened that did give me some direction, a sense of a problem. And, you know, partly I thought I ought to mention this because I've also heard that, you know, people I have taught, or like Craig Clunas, he was inspired by encountering the throne, a Chinese imperial throne, in his adolescence. And Robert Bickers, I think, says that, he found some book in the library about heaven knows what. He's mentioned 7 Years in Tibet by Heinrich Harrer. He said, there is a wider world. I knew there was a wider world, but what to do about it crystallized when I was 16 on my birthday, trying to look for a focus. I thought, you reach the age where you really ought to, have some idea about what you're going to do. And I found on my parents' bookshelves this book.
Okay.
It's by this guy called C. Northcote Parkinson, who, this is what professors looked like in the 50s and 60s, middle-aged white men in suits, yeah?
Yeah.
And he's well known in Britain. Have you heard of the name?
No, I haven't.
He was very well known in the 50s and 60s as a popular writer. He had been a professor of history in what was then Malaya, doing British Imperial Naval history, stuff like that. But he wrote a book which was such a bestseller that he was able to escape academic life. But he had to keep writing, you know, to stay out of academic life. And this was a little potboiler. The big success and why he's best known is because he discovered Parkinson's law.
Okay.
Parkinson's law states that work expands to fill the time allotted to its completion. And it explains the whole rise of bureaucracy in Western society and also especially in academic life.
I didn't realize it was the same.
Same guy.
Yeah.
So this is a little potboiler, and it's full of banal ideas. But it was a revelation in this sense. I had not been educated to know anything about Asia. Really, nothing. And, you know, I couldn't complain about my teachers. I mean, for one thing, my education by then was free because my mother's money ran out pretty quickly. As you know, these places are expensive. You probably explored that option. Yeah, it's pretty desperate. So her money had disappeared quickly, but I had got a scholarship. So my education was free, so I couldn't complain about my teachers. And as I pointed out, they gave me good advice. Insofar as they had been educated, they gave me a good education. There was nothing about Asia, nothing at all. And so I thought, my goodness, there's a whole, a good half of old world history I know nothing about. And so ever since then, I've been trying to remedy the defects in my education. I don't see myself as a scholar. People like you who do Tangut and so forth. That's scholarship. But I mean, for one thing, I realised that I wasn't well prepared for this because I'm British. And British have this attitude towards foreign languages. Why learn them when a foreigner will always be better than you at them? So I had this handicap, and it was probably good that I did manage during the years I was an undergraduate here to at least get a basic mastery of classical Chinese, and then in graduate school in America and Japan, again very basic reading knowledge and some conversational Japanese, very minimal, but. With that, I had to do the best I could with trying to learn what I hadn't been told. And in a sense, I think it was excellent that I was pointed in the direction of Chinese. There are plenty of other languages that I could have cudgelled my British brains to learn. But Chinese opens up so much. It opens up pre-modern Japanese and Korean and Vietnamese sources for a start. There is so much Buddhist material which tells you about South Asia. Extraordinary amounts. It's been calculated that 40 million characters were translated from Indian languages into Chinese, and that's it's not a cultural clash. It's a transfer of cultures much bigger than anything that happened in Europe. I got friends who deal with, Arabic learning in Spain and in medieval times and so on and so forth. That's important for the history of Europe and so forth. But Buddhism in China. I mean, I'm not like the late Stefano Tacchetti who was really interested in how how that works out and knew Sanskrit and Chinese and looked at the actual translations. But you can find a lot of stuff, even so, without knowing Sanskrit in those materials. It's worth looking at. So, but it was probably for the best that I went to SOAS and had the title of Professor of East Asian History, because it means I could spread myself around a bit. As I said, I never got the chance to learn Korean, but at least I felt obliged to take an interest in Japan and Korea, Vietnam to the extent that some extent, but also to at least figure out, Tanguts, Tibetans and Mongols and so forth, who they were, Khitan, Sogdians. There's a whole panorama of Asian history, to which I think Chinese is an excellent starting point. So I was very lucky that my teachers pointed me in that direction. But really, I feel that there's still so much for me to learn, and I'm frankly amazed that people should find, what I've published in any way worth reading, because
it's very interesting. It's very creative.
Well, that's because I don't take academic life seriously. I don't see myself as a scholar. My father, as it happened, worked with his hands rather than his brain, to take the Bensian distinction. And so he thought people who work with their brains are poseurs, and didn't mind saying so. So I seem to have absorbed a bit of that. I can't take it seriously. I find it very, very enjoyable. But it may be that the one thing I have tried to communicate to students, wherever they're from, is some degree of enthusiasm. Here, all these materials, the whole panorama is wide open for people to do stuff in their own way. And certainly, I look at your students, and they're very lucky. You've given them the basis for individual careers, which
Let's hope so.
well, we shall see. We shall see.
Yeah.
Well, I know there is this awful attrition rate in academic life. I've just got the feeling I've just scraped the surface, but like that book I picked up on the way up here, by young Chinese scholars now have wonderful opportunities there, especially if when I was a student, you could see that Chinese scholarship was entirely constrained by ideology. There was, we were taught to read some of it, so we knew what it was, but it was kind of depressing, So, one defect of that was it put me off Chinese scholarship, even though, in the past 40 years, things have actually shifted. If you look at people like Rung Xinjiang or someone like that, they really know what they're doing. And the older stuff too, the 1920s and 30s people, they were amazing, particularly amazing from that generation because they had traditional education, where they'd memorize a huge amount, and then they had and it happened in Japan as well, they've memorized a huge amount, but they then have a new methodology on top of it. And you get these people like, you ask them, where does this come from? And they think. And I've heard this at second hand. One friend said, young Lien Sheng, I once asked him, what's this? And he said nothing, but then he came back and he said, History of the Northern Way. My father made me memorize all those histories when I was a child. And then a friend in Buddhist studies who's working on Sung Buddhism, there's this guy called Iria, who was a scholar of Chinese literature, who was interested in Buddhist literature in particular. And she said to him, what's this? And again, he sort of paused, went into his library and said, it's a poem by Zhu Xi, here it is. And you know how much people like Zhu Xi wrote, and so I do try and pay attention, especially to people of that generation. But now, fortunately, with so much digitized, that's less of a problem. Although learning how to use digitized material is something else.
Can I ask you this question? What do you think the value for a Chinese graduate student is to come here to study in the West, whether it's in the UK or Europe or US? So what is it?
Because you're dealing with people who at least in my case, don't know what they're doing, so they ask stupid questions. But the stupid questions are sometimes the ones that prompt novel approaches and things like that, So I think the disadvantage, and that's one reason why, I avoid any subject that looks well established, is that things tend to get cut and dried, and there's a consensus. There are areas like Chinese studies a bit like that, and I'd rather go to the unexplored places, not forget the consensus. If you move on from a Chinese undergraduate degree to Chinese graduate work, unless you're working with a scholar who is really original, and China's a big country, there are quite a few of those, you may end up affected by, what should we call it, consensus, groupthink. You'll do good work, but it will be within a certain paradigm. Whereas here you can smash things up.
Okay.
Yeah, don't you think?
Yeah.
What attracts you or what attracts your students, do you think, to the situation?
Well, I don't know. I think primarily the name of Cambridge attracts them.
Yeah, there's always
to be
that.
Realistic.
Yes.
I think.
Yes. I found even between this country and the United States, it's a much smaller setup, but you don't have to go to those big conferences and hang out with huge numbers of people. And again, there's a push towards groupthink, I think, there. Here, nobody knows what you're doing. Really, how many people have you met who know what Tangut is?
That's true, yeah.
I mean, you can probably count on the fingers of one hand. I mean, just casual acquaintances. It's the same that, my middle daughter did an education degree in Darwin, a postgraduate, and she was sitting next to a Japanese guy, and she said, "What do you do?" And he said, "I do Pali." And she said, "Oh, Pali," and that absolutely staggered him. But obviously, through her dad, she knows people in that field, or knew people in that field. These academic kids, they get exposed to weird stuff, but the average citizen of this country, it's a problem. The education system is still grossly skewed towards Europe rather than Asia or the rest of the world. And in religious studies, actually, was where the best work was done by a group of scholars in the 50s and 60s who said, look, all this Christian theology is not enough. We do need to be aware that apart from Christianity, there are other beliefs around the globe as well. And there's a very small group, but they managed to get not only a few posts, as you can see from what happens here in Cambridge. It's difficult to get new posts in Buddhism or Islam or whatever, but they managed to get a few posts in a few departments. Lancaster was one, for example. But then they managed to get some of this stuff into schools. So I don't know what you found with British schools, but it seems to me that if a child goes through a British school, they will at least know what a mosque is, or a good one.
They go to a mosque.
Yeah, absolutely.
Visit mosques.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank goodness, because since these pioneers were trying to make the point about breaking the stranglehold of purely theological education, we've had a lot of immigrants. We had a lot more mosques, gurdwaras, Hindu temples, and the problem is that, of course, the bias there is still towards parts of the world that used to be coloured pink as part of the British Empire. So Islam we know about, Hinduism we know about, Buddhism was in Sri Lanka and Burma. China, we had a foothold in Hong Kong and so forth, but no teaching of anything to do with China of that sort in Britain anywhere. Show me a post in Taoism, for example, in Britain. There is a Chinese woman in Lampeter, I think, who does some teaching in Taoism, and otherwise there are enthusiasts here and there, but it's dangerously low levels of education, especially with a large number of specifically Hong Kong people moving in now. They're not because they don't come over in little boats. People don't notice, but there actually are substantial numbers of people who've relocated from Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. And it's not the same problem as having Muslims or Sikhs coming in, because Chinese don't have that kind of way of identifying themselves. A lot of them are actually Christians. There's a Baptist church probably a couple of 100 meters from where I live, which has services in Cantonese now. So they're being absorbed.
Who's the pastor?
The pastor is a Cantonese.
Okay.
I've not met him. I don't speak Cantonese, but I picked up one of the little leaflets. Very interesting, Chinese Christianity, because for a long time it's had to assert its independence of imperialism. Therefore, it's developed in ways which we ought to know about. You know, if we have, yes, the Baptists will be very kind to the Chinese believers and let them have their own congregation, but they ought to know, you know, a bit more about those. And of course, the Catholic Church as well. There are Catholic groups that are absorbing incomers from Hong Kong, but really, the big lack is not in. I mean, it would be good. There's this guy in Hong Kong, Lai Ji Tim, who's a professor of religious studies, does a lot with Taoism. He's just sent me an incredible 3-volume set of survey with copious pictures of the 130 temples in Hong Kong and the 455 inscriptions they contain. That, you know, there's nobody working on that kind of stuff in Britain as far. I mean, as it happens, you know, there are people like Adam who probably know. Adam Zhao knows a lot about it, but his work has been mainly in North China, and I don't know if you've run across the work of Steve Jones, the musician, who has a blog which is brilliant. He spent a lot of time in the countryside with Chinese musicians, but he knows a lot about the everyday religious environment that they work in. And he's published. Yeah, I mean, look out for his stuff. I mean, you wouldn't learn anything from it you'd want to know, except you know what life is like in the North Chinese countryside, a long way from you know, anywhere where academics hang out. He taught himself how to juggle so that he could, you know, had some skill that the villagers would actually find visible. But really, I mean, there's a big lack with that in religious studies. But of course, religious studies is not the way the Chinese identify themselves, primarily through a religious identity. You know, the identity comes through history. And of course, whilst in this country we do not teach the Opium Wars, we're in a really difficult position, you know.
It's actually funny because 2 hours ago I had somebody do the EPC certificate for my home.
Yes, I remember that. And
then we ended up talking about the Opium War.
Yeah.
We knew about it.
Yes, yeah. It's gradually seeping through. But really it ought to be on the curriculum.
Yeah, of course. It's part of this country's history too.
Oh, absolutely. And it's very interesting. Most of the recent work has been done on the first Opium War, but the second, that's what Marx was talking about, by the way, and his remarks are therefore quite interesting because he can see he has a perspective on the British, which is his own. It's a bit Marxist, if I can put it that way. But also we have a book on the so-called Arrow War by this diplomat, as he was at the time, called Douglas Hurd, who was eventually our foreign minister, very, very, very prominent politician who head boy at Eton, you know, that kind of background. And he obviously he's mainly interested in the political repercussions in Britain, which he's very good at because he was always interested in politics before he became a politician. But his take on what was going on and his view of the Chinese, which must have been the contemporary Foreign Office view of China, is very interesting. Mm-hmm. You know, the vast cultural gap between China and Britain and their understanding of international relations. But as far as he's concerned, you know, it's for the Chinese to learn how to behave themselves. I mean, it doesn't exactly say that, but it tends in that direction. You know, it's not, dialogue is not an option as far as I can see in the way he writes. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, this country's got a lot to learn. And I think I must devote some of my remaining years to trying to do something about that. I mean, there's a lot of fascinating stuff, if you know about Buddhist and Taoist materials. But I worry about my countrymen.
So how are you going to do that? Like, write more popular things?
Popular? I don't know. I mean, I tried to write a book on printing that was popular. With the result that I wrote it too quickly, and there are things that are wrong. You know, if you're in a hurry, it's very hard to. I'll say this about what I've written about printing. It's very hard to escape from confirmation bias, you know. But so that's a topic I ought to go back to. You may have noticed, I think you've got a copy of the occasional paper I did, which does some stuff about printing Buddhism and Taoism.
Yeah.
I ought to turn that into a more solid book. But yeah, that's that.
You have that book also on Taoism and printing with Minnow Press.
That's the one I'm referring to.
Okay.
Yeah, yes.
I did a book review of that.
You were the only person to review it.
Okay.
For Peter Kornitsky's journal.
Yes.
Yes, and I'm grateful for that.
East Asian Publishing. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because obviously it's just an occasional paper. It was just to have it in print, because in fact I'd realised, you see, by that time there was a lot that I'd missed out, and I must go back and work that stuff up into a full book, but it would be an academic book. But yeah, I've got to try and do something with Britain and China. I've been doing stuff about the development of Chinese studies. And I've reached the point where I realise that yeah, we can look at the development of Chinese studies. It's the non-development of Chinese studies that we have to look at, you know. All the great heroes like Morrison and Legge and Arthur Waley, great guys. Extraordinary how they managed to flourish when the environment in which they worked was so non-supportive. I mean, Morrison and Legge at least had God on their side, you know, as it were, and probably needed that. Waley learnt how to cope by creating a persona which in his later work is very different from his early work. In his early work he is quite unguarded, but I think what he realised is that the French were making the running, and he had to be careful, you know, not to look like a fool. So he wised up, and especially what helped him was he came into an inheritance and didn't have to work except on you know, which of course I mean that obviously for most of us, you know, we're only in that situation when we retire. So I really appreciate that he actually had got out of the British, what was the British Library, British Museum, same organisation in his day, and really became much more of a scholar because of that. When he was writing stuff for Bloomsbury when he was a young man, it's good, but you can sometimes see spots and spaces there, you know. So yeah, it's interesting to look back on these guys, but what I want to write about is the other side of the coin. How hopeless I mean, French have an intellectual interest, Hungarians have an intellectual interest in stuff, right? Seems to be a Hungarian vice. Brits, utterly pragmatic. If it makes money, you know, if it doesn't, what's the point? And so these people who are trying to promote Chinese studies are working in a very hostile environment. I mean, one thing I want to go back to and look at carefully is, you know, there's a national curriculum, right? You've probably suffered a bit of that, yeah? Yep. It's got history in it and stuff, yeah? Well, a very helpful scholar of British imperialism actually invited some of us to, who was acting as an advisor, actually invited one or two of us to have some input. So we had some input, and they came up with what was, to be honest, a slightly overcomplicated scheme for history. But it did ensure that non-Western history was a obligatory part of education for early teenage years. It's still there as you know, you can do all kinds of options, but it's optional. So nobody does it because the teachers can't pronounce Chinese words and they don't want to be embarrassed. You know, it's as simple as that, I think. But this curriculum had obligatory non-Western history. It didn't have to be Chinese, but you did have to, you couldn't avoid tackling some. I heard later that this was shown to Margaret Thatcher. He said, we don't want this foreign nonsense. And so the current curriculum, as I say, it's not that you can't pursue that option, but because it's an option. Nobody is, you know, this book, nobody's compelled to confront the fact there is a world beyond Europe. And that, I think, was, you know, whatever you think of Margaret Thatcher, I think that was a profoundly unpatriotic thing to do, you know, to have the chance to prepare your nation to be part of the wider world and to turn it down. Extraordinary.
Especially, you still had Hong Kong, for example.
Yeah, I still had Hong Kong at that point. Yeah.
Wow.
I don't know. I mean, rather than rabbiting on myself, I'd be much more interested to ask you what you've made of your 12 years of teaching in Britain.
11 years.
11
years.
Oh, yeah, but probably it'll feel like 12 with the post-traumatic stress and all of that.
Yeah. No, I was... well, it's not my interview now.
Oh, well, I'm trying to turn the tables on you.
Yeah. It was very interesting. One of the first things that I noticed as I came here, how good the students were.
Yeah.
Because I did teach a little bit at UC Santa Barbara.
Oh, right.
And also a little bit at Berkeley.
Shall I tell you about UC Santa Barbara?
Yes,
you know that this scholar who worked on Sun Dun Huang stuff, John McCrae, was a friend of mine, and got to know him quite well. And I visited him in Santa Barbara, and I knew he'd also taught in UCLA. Have I told you this? I mean, it's absolute classic, reveals, you know, what American student life was like. I said, so what are the students like in UCLA versus Santa Barbara? He said, well, in Santa Barbara, they usually appear in beachwear, and in UCLA, they're into dressing up. And that was, to him, the big distinction between the two. So, and you know that James Robson was the first encounter with John McCrae. John was out of academic life at the time. He was working as a beach guard. And James Robson was a teenager who was into sort of girls and surfing. And nothing else. I mean, he had trouble graduating from high school, but his first encounter with John McCrae was being chased off a beach by him. You know, it's like the first time I went into the university library with Dennis Twitchett. There was a guy at the front desk, and he was older than, you know, most of the staff are now. And he looked at him and said, "Good afternoon, Professor Twitchett." We walked up to the stairs, you know, from the front desk, and I said, "What's that about?" He said, he was a university bulldog, and the first time I encountered him, I was running hard in the opposite direction, you know, for some reason, but he never forgot a face. And so even though he was, you know, he'd first met as an undergraduate, he still remembered that Twitchett. So, yeah. It's...
yeah, but Santa Barbara was, in fact, quite different from Berkeley.
Yeah.
So at Berkeley, you had students who were trying to work really hard.
Yeah.
And at Santa Barbara, they did go to the beach.
The beach, yes.
And it was like, if they had, one guy was with crutches.
Yeah.
And they asked, it was a surfing accident.
Yeah. Well, that's like when I first went to Yale, and there were so many people on crutches. And I thought, oh my God, you know, you find people around Cambridge who are on crutches because of rugby, right? But I noticed in those days, it would be unusual to see a woman on crutches, certainly here, because women weren't playing rugby in those days. But then I noticed the women are on crutches too. Well, I didn't realise that they go skiing at the weekends up in Vermont and places, you know.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's stop here.
Okay.
And thank you again for coming.
You're welcome. Well, thank you.
Doing this little supplement.
Edit it any way you want.
All right.
Yeah.
I'll do that.
Yeah. But at least cover my mistakes. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Bye-bye.